Hello, welcome to the Mayborn Literary Nonfiction Conference 2021. And we have a very special guest today, Major Garrett. Welcome to the Mayborn family.
Neil, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me, and I look forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. I don't know if we have enough days to cover all the topics, but we'll keep it tight.
Sure.
I know, but just for those, I'll do a quick intro here, and then I just really want folks to learn a little bit about from you and your career. But as many of you know, Major's the CBS CBS News' chief Washington correspondent. He's covered 5 administrations, at least that I'm aware of from your bio, from George W. Bush to President Clinton, Obama, Trump, and now Biden. He's traveled the world. He's covered every major issue for the last 20, 25 years that you can imagine, from ISIS to U.S.-European negotiations with Russia, to the Obama administration healthcare rollout, to presidential campaigns, the war in Iraq. We'll hear a little bit about how he started in his business and why he really has such a connection to our Mayborn audiences. He has published 4 books over the last several years. So he's cut his teeth in the old print world, which we'll dive in. The University of Missouri graduate, and we had a great conversation prior to coming on with Dean Miller, who shares Missouri with you. The native of San Diego, now is based in DC. So Major, thanks again for being here. And what I don't think a lot of folks know is that you started your career obviously at the Missourian, and then it kind of took off from there. How did you end up in journalism in the first place?
So I had 3 great fascinations as a child, Neil. One was baseball, the other was acting, and the third was chasing after fire engines that went by my neighborhood house in Kearny Mesa in San Diego. And I thought I would be a Major League Baseball player, but about age 12 or 13, I realized I could not, for the life of me, hit a curveball, no matter how hard I tried. So that dream had to sort of be set aside. I did acting in high school and junior high, but I didn't have the actor's temperament, meaning I didn't have that ability, that rare ability to pull all of yourself out of a situation and put a character brand new in you and inhabit that character that was completely different from who you were. That's an amazing talent, and it takes a tremendous amount of psychic energy and balance, something I just didn't have. So I'm like, well, I can't be an actor either, but I keep chasing after these fire engines, metaphorically and genuinely. And that told me that I needed to be near where things were happening. I just wanted to be inside the tape, if you think about it that way. And I was born in 1962, so I sort of came of age, if you will, understanding the world around me in little bits and pieces about age 7, when most of us do. That's when we start, at least for me, starting imagining that there's a world beyond our doorstep and your bedroom and the dining room table. Well, let's think about what year that was. That's 1969. There's an amazing amount that goes on in America in 1969. And if you haven't even tiptoed into that, just go back and look at that year, and it will blow your mind. All the things, tragic, unbelievable accomplishments. We went to the moon in 1969. There were terrible protests, there were riots, there was Vietnam. All these things were happening at once, building off of a very difficult year of 1968. And so all of that was landing on my doorstep every day. We got 2 newspapers in San Diego, the Los Angeles Times and the San Diego Union Tribune. My parents, because of their upward middle-class sensibilities, got all 3 news magazines, not just one, Time, Newsweek, and U.S. News and World Report. And we were a TV news family. I was enraptured by 60 Minutes, and I watched the evening news every night. And something just told me that this is something that was really important in the world. And the older I got and the more my other dreams got set aside, the more I knew I wanted to do this kind of thing if I ever could have a chance at it. So I quickly figured out when I was in high school, at the newspaper, at the yearbook, doing all those normal things, what was the best school of journalism? University of Missouri. So I left home and went there. Got a degree in journalism, a degree in political science in 4 years, was president of the SPJ on campus, won 2 scholarships, thought I had checked every single box anyone could ever check to be a successful University of Missouri grad. Turns out I was the only member of my graduating class to graduate without a job. The only member of my graduating class on the print journalism side who crossed that stage unemployed. I was the most conspicuous failure of my 1984 journalism graduating class, and everybody knew it, chiefly me. And I want everyone to understand that, because it felt as if my career was ending before it even began. And I had to reconcile myself to this rude truth that the 67 rejection letters, Neil, that I received that entire senior year looking for a job, newspapers as large as the beloved LA Times that was on my doorstep as a child, to as small as the La Crosse, Wisconsin Tribune. Let me say that again, La Crosse, Wisconsin Tribune, all said to me, we have no room for you. Maybe call us back or write us in 5 or 6 years. So I had nothing. All that work, all those accomplishments, all those boxes checked, nothing. Until a Mizzou grad called up in June of '84, about 6 or 8 weeks after I graduated, and had an opening for a cop reporter. I took that job sight unseen, basically, whatever they were going to pay me. I jumped into that job, was in Amarillo, Texas for 2 years, Las Vegas, Nevada for 2 years, Houston, Texas for 2 years, made a jump to Washington in 1990 and have been here ever since. But that early part of college where I scrambled as high on that hill as I possibly thought I had to climb, and for a moment had nothing to show for it, was an early tester. And it only proves a couple of things. One, failure is real. It can happen much sooner than you ever think it will. It can knock you on your backside in a very significant way. And it can make you wonder if you've made any right choices in your life. And you got to decide whether or not this is the thing you love or the thing you don't love. And it was the thing I loved, and I stuck to it.
You said the key word is the thing you loved. I remember being a journalism grad around that time as well. And what I often remind my students is we used to have to type out those resumes.
Right? Oh, yes.
And
type them out one at a time. Yes.
Type out those cover letters,
Yep.
Stuff them in an envelope and mail them and crossed your fingers and hope they got there and that you even got a response back, no less a phone call or anything. But
right.
And that was grueling now. That was grueling then, which again, I have to calm my students down and say, well, when did you send the email? Yesterday? No, you won't hear back tomorrow, right?
And just in case anyone's curious, yes, I still have that manila folder with all 67 rejections letters. I carry with me everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
As a reminder.
Mm-hmm.
As a reminder.
I have the letter from the Washington Post where I was originally rejected with the typo in my name that I've held on to, that, fortunately it was 5 years later that they finally did hiring, but I was like, well, okay, well, you got to start somewhere, right?
Exactly.
So where did broadcast come into play? I mean, you obviously were motivated, you did the journey, but along some really strong local newspapers. I mean, these are great newspapers for young journalists to do some good stuff. When did broadcast come to play? You obviously moved to DC and you were working for the Washington Times at the time when you got there?
Yes, that was my first job because as someone who had never covered a city council or a state legislature, the Washington Post was not going to hire me to cover national politics or even Virginia or Maryland politics or DC politics. But I thought maybe the Washington Times would. And so as it happened, I came up to the DC area to go see a Baltimore Orioles baseball game. And a friend of mine said, why don't you type out a resume and just walk it in there and just cold call them? Just what do you got to lose? And I did. And they said, well, can you get us some clips in a day? And I called a friend at the Houston Post and they FedExed me a bunch of clips. And I came back the next day and they said, well, we don't have anything right now, but we'll get back to you. And I'm like, okay, I'll never hear back. It was well, all right. I walked in, they didn't kick me out. So I guess it wasn't a total disaster. And 3 or 4 weeks later, not only did they call me back, they said, well, we don't have anything for you on the Metro desk. Would you like to cover Congress? And I'm like, what? Cover what? And I thought to myself, you realize I've never covered a city council or a state legislature. You realize I'm not saying any of this. And sure enough, that was my first job. So I got here in 1990. And trust me, that was a grueling 2 or 2.5 years with constant feelings of not just failure, but abject failure, because Congress is a tough place. It has a language all of its own. It's an architecture all of its own, an institutional history and knowledge and manner of speaking all of its own. look, the Washington Times was not a great or respected newspaper then, not to say that it is now, but it was especially held in low regard, if you will, at that time. So it took even more effort, not just to learn the basics, but also to prove myself as a worthy journalist of even being talked to by anyone. And that was a huge campaign, and it took a long time. And that was the time of testing as well. But I proved my worth. And one of the greatest moments, and I can't remember the year, but I remember Tim Russert, when he was moderating Meet the Press, didn't read my byline, but he read something and questioned somebody on Meet the Press from a story I had written in the Washington Times. And I said to myself, okay, I'm not completely lost. This is not an endeavor that's going nowhere. I'm beginning to get some kind of traction. And that was 7 years. Then I wrote my second book. Then I was at US News and World Report, thinking I'd sort of made it. I mean, right down the hallway was Gloria Borger and Michael Barone. They were my colleagues. And I actually thought, I've reached the summit. There's nothing higher than this. And incidentally, I'll tell you this other quick story, Neil. So when I was younger, I had 3 times applied to be a reporter at the San Diego Union Tribune, my hometown newspaper. And 3 times I had been turned down. Then they called me when I was at US News and World Report. And I'm like, kids, you had your chance. You had your chance. I've moved beyond you now. And sorry, I don't have any room for the Union Tribune in my life anymore. And if I had gotten that job at the Union Tribune, I might not have never made it to Washington. So sometimes the things that feel like setbacks in a moment can actually be springboards. And that's another thing I think what people should hear about. So TV came to me completely accidentally. The quick story is this. My wife at the time, we're now divorced. We're good friends. We're not enemies, but she was my wife at the time. She was in television. She was being interviewed by Frank Sesno to be the #2 reporter for CNN at the White House. I told her to take the job. I was all enthusiastic. She turned it down flat. And at that interview, Frank Sesno, the bureau chief of CNN, said, well, I've looked at all the tapes. I don't have anyone else to interview. So who do you recommend? And my ex-wife said, well, I'm not going to recommend anyone to a job I just turned down. And he said, let me rephrase the question. Who's the best reporter you know? And my then wife said, well, my husband. Well, who's that? Major Garrett. What's his number? Frank Sesno whips out his cell phone. She's like, what? What's his number? Dials me up. Hi, Major, Frank Sesno here. I'm sitting here with your lovely wife. She doesn't want to work for me. Do you do? Call me back. Click. And from that, I got into television.
There you go. It's all in who you know, right?
I mean, come on. I mean, that's not how you draw it up. Okay. That's not how the playbook reads at all. And, you know, briefly, my thinking was, well, someone in the family should make this money and take this job. Why not me? And I will tell you, Frank, when he interviewed me, he said, can you handle television? I said, I don't know. You're the TV guy. I'm the print guy. Don't expect me to answer that question. You want to make the call? You hire me. And I'll see if I can figure it out. We'll figure it out together, Frank. And it took. So I've been doing it ever since. But it was not something I aspired to. It was not something I ever sought. I never, ever imagined a life in television, ever. And if you watch those early live shots for CNN, you'll see why. Not good.
That's a hard thing to do, live shots, isn't it? When you're first
especially when you have no training in it. And I've often said jokingly, but also half seriously, if I had to watch any of those early live shots for CNN, I think I would go to the United Nations and say I was a victim of a war crime or something, or a human rights violation of some kind, because I would be very hard pressed to watch any of those early live shots over again. It would be too painful.
So here you are in Washington, D.C. You've learned how to cover Congress. You've now landed at CNN. That's just really beginning to pick up its momentum as kind of this major kind of news source, really giving the networks a run for the money. And you're thrown into a tumultuous time. So I'm gathering those print skills came in handy because you had to do some really heavy duty reporting. And I think, what a lot of people think is, oh, you're covering the White House. What a coveted beat, right?
Mhm.
Not an easy beat to cover, right?
It's not an easy beat to cover, and it's much more a televised beat for sure. And the live shot in front of the North Portico, I mean, that's the money television news live shot position. And when I tell young television reporters that I never covered local news, and the first live shot I ever did on television was on the North Lawn of the White House, they kind of want to beat me up because it just seems like such an outrage to them. But the print background made an enormous difference for me. The print background made an enormous difference in the ability to study things quickly, assemble facts quickly, and be confident in their presentation. The one thing that print disabled me, at least early on in television, is I would give live shots and reports as if I was a print reporter, 5 or 6 paragraphs. And nobody in television can listen to 5 or 6 paragraphs. They just can't. You have to simplify, tighten things down to their essence, and do so with a degree of confidence that you simply can't sustain if you're trying to tell someone a 6-paragraph story. You just can't do it, especially when you're first trying to do live television. So that simplification, that concentrated process of sort of tightening the story down to its essence, is something you have to learn. And the only way you learn it is through repetition. Athletes talk about this all the time. You just have to have reps. You just have to keep doing it over and over and over again until you develop something like a muscle memory. And when you're doing it on the North Lawn and there are 12 correspondents next to you, and there's just a cacophony of noise in your ears, plus what you're hearing from the control room, that makes all of this even more difficult. And the only way you can learn to do it is by doing. There is no book to read. There is no documentary to watch. There's no dramatic film or play to watch. You have to do it yourself. And what you have to do with those repetitions is just make them each incrementally better. Because if you're backsliding and all you do is backslide, you're not going to get the reps because they're not going to put you on television. So what you have to concentrate on is slight microscopic improvement with each and every repetition, and hold on to that teeny bit of improvement, knowing you're going to have times where things are going to fall back a step or two and you're going to blow one and you'll be like, oh, what happened? Well, you screwed up. You made a mistake. You lost your train of thought. But overall, each one is slightly better than the one before it. And if you keep that progress going, they'll keep you on television, and keeping you on television gives you the reps, and the reps help you get to a better place.
Oh, that's fascinating. Thanks for the insights on that. I mean, part of that is the technique, and part of it, which is a big part I want to kind of dive into, is kind of getting the story and what we know about. And we could do a whole session on just White House journalism and covering institutions. And I want to unpack that a little bit deeper, and just talking about how, over the years, how do you unpack the story there? How do you filter out the spin? How do you factor in, what we've been, we got into deeply into this in the last several years about truth and fiction and fake news and all that. But to me, that's part of kind of what you face with any White House, and trying to control what the message the president wants to tell us,
right,
and what you and your role as a journalist is to tell us. How did you learn how to do that better, and what techniques have you developed over the years to try to get through that, understanding your role as a journalist?
So the one thing I would say is you have to research your topic really well. You have to know what the past has been, not just yesterday's past, but a few years in the rear view. Because if you don't have that, you're much more willing to be spun. See, spin works when you don't know what you're talking about. The way to combat spin is to know what you're talking about, to have researched a lot of things about a story, have talked to several different people, have lots of different perspectives. So when the spin comes to you, and spin is not a crime, spin is not venal, spin is an orientation to an argument you're trying to make because you need to win a political argument. That's what they do. I don't begrudge them that in the slightest. But my job as a journalist is to understand they're going to do that, not be angry with them or waste any emotion on that process, but pick apart their argument as succinctly and as distinctly as I can. And that comes with research, being grounded in not just today's history, but a little bit of past history. And that applies to every issue, whether it's water, federal regulations for water, something that's kind of obscure, but deeply important to the people who are affected by it, whether it's abortion or firearms regulation, or anything dealing with authorization to use military force, what we used to call a war declaration. Why don't we do that anymore? What's the history on that? Whether it's Medicaid or Medicare, you better know the difference. And you better know, if you're talking about Medicare, well, is it A, B, C, or D? And you better know what A, B, C, and D are. And you better know what the repayment schedules are. And you better know what the payroll tax deduction levels are. Because if you don't, you're going to be lost. And you can't learn everything all at once. But whenever I was going to call somebody up, especially when I was young in Washington, I would spend a couple of hours in the library burrowing down. So when I picked up that phone, I had at least something underneath me. Because when you're a young reporter in Washington, you pick up the phone and you talk to someone of semi-important status, and they can tell in 5 seconds whether you know anything. And if you don't, they're going to hang up. They're not going to deal with you. Like, you're not a serious person. And so I always tried to approach these things from as filling in as much as I thought the perceived deficit of my knowledge would be as a young reporter, to get over that first hurdle and to keep the conversation going. And the longer you're in Washington, the more institutional knowledge you build, the more things you've seen, the more ways you've seen both legislation and public debates play out. You remember things about the first time Republicans controlled Congress. There are very few people in Washington who remember that. Not only do I remember it, I covered it and I wrote a book about it. You know, a very well-received book, a 10-year look back at the contract with America. That sort of was an alternate history to the 6 books written all by Clinton White House officials that basically said Bill Clinton won every debate with the Republican Congress. Not true. He won a lot of them, but he didn't win all of them. And the things he called victories, he would have called defeats when those debates began, but he manufactured a way to figure out a way to look like he won. Anyway, that institutional knowledge builds up over time, and it makes it more useful for you to have conversations, especially when you start getting to my age. I'm 59 now, where I'm the one who's sort of helping some spinners along. I'm like, you know what? Let's just take 5 seconds here, because you could do that a lot better than you're currently doing it. And I'll just say, don't waste it on me. But if you're going to do that, try this or that, because what you got right now is weaker than it needs to be. You're just not really helping yourself. So I'm in an odd position at times now where I know the spin almost before it comes out of their mouth. And the other thing that happens over time is, look, when you're in a position of power, or you're seeking to be in a position of power in Washington, you pay attention to people whose journalism matters. And there are a lot of people whose journalism matters much more than mine. Lots of great, incredible reporters in Washington. But I'm in a league of respectability and stature. At the lower end, I would say, compared to some other people I can think of and name. But we all matter. And the longer you're around and the more you are in that matter category, the shorter your conversations are with people in power, because everyone cuts right to the chase. And those conversations can get a lot done in like 45 seconds. Whereas when I was a young reporter, it would take me 9 or 10 or 15 calls to get that 45 seconds of knowledge I can gain now. So that's another thing that comes with an accumulated career in a place like Washington.
I love that story. You're telling you that you've been in Washington long enough where you can educate your sources about no. The contract of America said this.
Said this, yes.
It did not say that. So
yeah.
Let's start again, right?
Right.
Which I guess goes to the question that's been in on our minds a lot these days, but also in this question, the role of us as journalists and storytellers is our role to call out officials and sources when they're not telling the truth? How do we balance that? I mean, again, I don't think it's distinct to what we saw in the Trump White House and any other, because I think every president does this to a certain extent. I think it certainly was amplified perhaps with the Trump administration, but talk about this role of how you've tried to navigate, and how do you call out officials, and how do you balance this knowledge of the subject with spin and telling the truth?
Yeah, so one thing I like about my career is I've attended a lot of presidential press conferences, and I've asked questions of every president I've covered, starting with President Clinton in his last year of office, George W. Bush, President Obama, President Trump, all their vice presidents and everything in between. And I've always, I enjoy the fact, and I'm encouraged by my approach to this craft, that every communications director and press secretary for every one of those presidents has yelled at me about a question I asked their boss. So I'm good with that. Not in a, you'll never work in this town again, or you'll never have lunch at the Palm, or, you know, you'll never get a reservation at Hey Adams. But like, what, yeah, how dare you? What's your jihad? What the hell's wrong with you? And all that stuff. Like, okay, good. I got your attention. Fine. And that's part of the give and take. That's part of the essence of what a press secretary, communications director for the president of the United States does, and what someone empowered with a microphone for the nation, which is what I believe you hold when you ask a president a question. You're holding the microphone on behalf of the country because you're trying to find out what the president's thinking, why he's done what he's done, or why he's going to do what he's about to do. So that role is super important in the job of being a White House correspondent. There are those who criticize White House reporters as being nothing more than glorified stenographers. And there is a stenography part of the White House beat. You have to record faithfully what the president says and does. That's true. And that doesn't mean it's just being a stenographer. You're just dutifully copying down what the president says. But that is an important part of the job, because what the president says, or what an executive order says, changes things in our country. And if you don't get that part of it right and don't understand what's happening and what's going to flow from that, you're missing a very big part of the functional day-to-day job of the presidency. So I've always had a bit of an issue with the, oh, you're just glorified stenographers. Oh yeah? You want to take that stenography day in and day out? You want to do that? You go ahead, you give it a shot, because it's not as easy as it sounds. But then there's this other component part of it is, which is holding a president to account. You said this, the results are this. Or just to take a modern example, President Biden got very good questions in April and May about what would happen in Afghanistan. He gave very declaratory answers, as he's entitled to do. And the lived experience did not match his declaratory answers. Well, those questions were really good questions. Now, when they were asked and answered, they didn't create nearly as much news in the moment as they did when lived events happened. And that's part of the continuous dialogue that the White House press corps has with the presidency. And that's something I think that is less appreciated than it ought to be. Oh, it's another briefing. Oh, it's another press conference. No, it's part of the day-to-day conversation. And we will go back to conversational moments that at the time they occurred, didn't make the New York Times, didn't make the Washington Post, didn't lead the CBS Evening News, but they're a nugget of presidential perspective. And then there's a lived event. You're like, oh, what did he say about that? Well, we all keep it. It's all archived. It's there. It's part of this continuous conversation. So that accountancy part of the job is day to day, hour to hour. And you're not necessarily going to have that moment where everyone looks around and says, man, you got that. That was amazing. But you might have gotten something amazing that only amazes us in terms of its revelation or revelatory quality 3 or 4 months from now. And that's part of the constancy of covering the White House, building that long-term conversation that has moments where you get something out of the president that he hasn't. So far, it's only been he. Eventually, it'll be he and she, but right now it's only he hasn't said before. And one last point on this, there's been a tremendous amount of conversation about President Trump and his orientation to the truth and the White House press corps and calling him out. We can certainly talk about that. But look, I'm asked, what story do you regret the most in your career? There's one. When I was covering Congress and the question about authorizing use of force in Iraq was before Congress, I very quickly figured out all the votes were there. And I stopped thinking about and reporting about the skeptical arguments about whether or not we should do this. And I merely covered it as a process vote story. I regret that more than anything in my career, because I didn't take seriously enough the skeptics who voted no. All I cared about was, well, you're not going to have enough no votes, so it's not going to go down. all of us in Washington should have paid much more attention to what those skeptics, those critics were saying, because they saw things that proved to be vitally important to the lived history of that misbegotten war. And I regret intensely treating that as a process power story, not is it true, not true story. And that was a huge mistake on my part and a lot of my other colleagues' part.
Yeah, I think that's, I spent, I guess, about 9 years in Washington and 4 of those at the Post, and that was always the challenge of not getting caught up into the spin, particularly with Congress,
or the mindset,
right?
or the sense of, and at a certain level, that is the most important part of that story. Is it going to pass? Well, yeah, it looks like it's going to pass. All the right people are for it. Dick Gephardt's for it. He's helping to write the resolution in the House with the White House to authorize the use of force. Hillary Clinton's for it. John Kerry's for it. Joe Biden's for it. Okay. Oh yeah, you got this handful of critics. All right, it's going to pass. Let's just focus on that. Nah, bad call. And, as you all know, there's one tiny cadre of journalists in McClatchy who didn't buy that.
Right.
They got a movie about it. They came in second or third place for a Pulitzer, but they were right on a huge, massive story. And because it wasn't the New York Times, because it wasn't, with all due respect, the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, they got less credit and attention than they should have gotten at the time. And there was just a little bit of too much journalistic groupthink. So that's nothing to do with Donald Trump. That's got not one iota of a thing to do with Donald Trump. And I think that was a collective, huge swing and miss for a lot of Washington reporters, myself very much included.
Does that made you more of a skeptic in approaching stories, or how did you? I mean, how
it just has made me more cautious. It just has made me more cautious about the idea that the process power story is the only one to focus on. And it's also created for me this great appetite to live in the podcast world, where I can create conversations or journalism of a audio documentary basis that dig deeper, that ask more, I hope, penetrating questions, that inform the way I do other things on television, but just widens the aperture, which is a cliche, but it's still metaphorically useful to think about. And I've just tried to be more cautious about the idea that I know exactly what the story is and what its most appropriate dimensions are or aren't. But as you know, Neil, as I'm going to jump in real quick, as you know, that's a continuous conversation with your editors, and editors are part of that conversation too. And if you go back to the movie done about the McClatchy journalists about the Iraq War, they were getting nothing but heat from all their editors and all the papers who didn't want to run those stories, being skeptical of the Iraq intelligence. So they were getting fire-breathing pushback in their own newsroom. So look, I'm not saying that this is a simple thing. Or if we all just had a better lunch one day and said, oh, we're going to cover this as a skeptic story, not a process power story, everything would have been changed. No, it wouldn't have been changed in all likelihood, but we could have been better.
Which, and part of this kind of being better, it also goes into not only the skepticism, but I want to talk a little bit about kind of the trust in media and again, there's wide-ranging conversation and concern that, well, over the last 4 years, the media's trust less, even more so than ever. What's your view on this? I mean, you've lived this. You have lived the transition over the last almost 30 years of media's ongoing love and hate with its audience, but still having to be focused on the story, but also experiencing this turmoil within newsrooms themselves of how do you survive? How do you get audience? How do you get readers? How do you balance, the story of the day with what the spin of the day is? I mean, you're living this every day. So what can you tell us about how we interpret, our trust as journalists? Certainly for an audience here, we've got some aspiring journalists who are looking to get into this business, and we've got some folks like you and I who've been around, and it's like with every iteration, we're like, okay, yeah, we've seen this before. We'll get through it.
So what you're asking me, Neil, is a coping question. How do you cope, Major? I weep a lot. Okay, I just curl up in a ball and I weep a lot, which is a glib answer to a very serious set of questions, but it's not altogether in moments of true honesty far from the truth. There are times that I feel this viscerally. I feel this animosity toward the media. I feel this collective disregard and disgust with the media in a very deep and personal way. And I am only one reporter for a large news organization. I can't change anything entirely by myself, but I can do what I can. So there are a lot of meta questions you ask, and I'll try to get to them as I remember them. But one big thing I want to leave everyone with is the idea that in all endeavors, in all human endeavors, trust has to be earned. But for a period of time in America, post-World War II, when the perils of that war were vivid and there was a news medium, newspapers and radio that captured it, and everything in the world and our country and its future felt like it was hanging in the balance, there was a tremendous psychic and genuine reliance on that medium to express what was happening. Then television came along and it amplified that power structure, embedded first in newspapers and in radio. And many of the people who first succeeded in television came out of the newspaper tradition. And the carryover effect of that trust in radio, Edward R. Murrow and H.G. Keltenborn and others, and great newspapers in our country, radiated into the world of this brand new, incredible medium of television. And as television grew and we connected ourselves with satellites and things, the power of it, the centrality of it was almost incomprehensible. And with it came a tremendous sense of reliance and trust because there was no alternative. Nothing was actually earned. It was ever present because there was no other thing. It was this massive creation without predicate, without precedent, and there was no escaping it. And so nothing was actually earned. It just existed, like organic. It just happened. Whoa, it's just this thing. And with that came tremendous power, as was said in my favorite movie, Network, by Howard Beale. The tube can make presidents, popes, prime ministers. It's the greatest goddamn propaganda machine in the whole godless world. I'm quoting Howard Beale directly from the movie Network, written by Patty Chayefsky, a CBS radio writer originally. It was this great forum and all this power built up around it. And with that, in tremendous amounts of money, market share, ratings, everything. No, we thought it was earned. I'm not so sure it was, because as soon as alternates came to that in the massively disruptive new technology of the internet world, people started picking and choosing all these other alternatives, which tells me instinctively that that was not trust earned, it was trust just accreted through this system. And when there were alternatives to that system, people started picking and choosing their alternatives. And then algorithms allowed those alternatives to become psychically embedded. I'm not giving you a complex mental theory. If you choose a news feed on the internet, it will replicate your news feed over and over and over again. That's the whole business model, which was kind of the business model of network television. We give you the same kind of sitcoms over and over and over again. You know, Andy Griffith's show leads to the Beverly Hillbillies. I mean, which leads to Gilligan's Island, whatever. It's all the same thing, more or less. Variations, but the same thing. Well, same thing with news feeds now. And news feeds now make you feel as if you can get all sorts of news coming to you exactly the way you want it, whenever you want it. You don't need the intermediary, the messy intermediary of your local newspaper. You get things pretty much the way you want them to be. And that allows you, as the consumer, to dictate the terms of trust. And as you dictate the terms of trust, you dictate where your dollar goes. And so this enormous relationship that a lot of us, I thought I had in Amarillo, in Las Vegas, and Houston. I'm connected to my community. They're connected to me through the newspaper. It snapped. And suddenly you don't feel like you need the Las Vegas Review Journal or the Houston Post, or the Houston Chronicle for that matter. And that leads us to this even bigger question: how do we regain that? Slowly, I think, initially. People have to be worn out by the sameness of their news feed. They have to see the dangers of their own kind of news groupthink. They have to see things that are dangerous that come to our country that we never saw before, some of which manifested itself during the Trump era, but not entirely. They have to see the dangers of singled out streams of news that lack perspective. And they have to see that there is something that they're inherently losing as consumers of news when, as I often say to people, if you wake up in the morning and all the news you consume until you go to bed at night leaves you feeling secure, ratified, and comfortable, then you're doing it wrong. You need to shift those patterns. And I think political actors also need to understand that there is something deeply intellectually and structurally enervating about constantly going on your own network to have home team interviews, which is basically what Democrats do on MSNBC and Republicans do on Fox. Every interview is a home game. When every interview is a home game, you don't have to work out anything. You don't have to understand the other argument. You don't have to have a counter argument. You don't have to have anything. You just get to show up and play patty cake with the home team. That's not good for your party. It's not good for your level of argumentation. It's not good for American politics. It makes everything weaker, not stronger, weaker. Now, what I've just described hasn't even begun to happen. I can only hope that this will become increasingly fatiguing and less nourishing to the American mind, the American body politic, and there will be a reappreciation of what actual journalism is and can be. And that's, again, going back to podcasts, one of the things I've tried to do with a younger audience, teaching them ways that journalism can exist that are not the ways you are accustomed to seeing them if all you knew as you grew up was an MSNBC household or a Fox household. I'm trying to carve out something that's more neutral. Objective is a freighted word, and lots of people don't like that word, but neutral and balanced in its overall perspective, meaning it will listen to both sides. None of that goes, Neil, to your question about how do you exist day to day as a functioning business operation. If I had that answer, sir, I'd have a different job.
And that's a bigger question. I mean, I think the interesting thing about your career is you've seen journalism from various news organizations that, again, nowadays would either be viewed as too liberal or too conservative. If
you look at my Washington career, it's 30 years, 15 in center right newsrooms and 15 in center left newsrooms. I love that.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard the arguments in both newsrooms. I've heard the arguments in both newsrooms. I've seen the way stories are thought about and constructed, and I'm not afraid of either side, and I'm not allergic to either side of a debate. And that I think that's been helpful to me. I think it's helped me to be more constantly curious. And for the young journalists out there, if there's one thing you have to constantly be, it's curious. And that's my biggest failing with that Iraq war story. I wasn't curious enough.
Well, I mean, that's an ongoing debate that my wife, who's also a retired journalist, have about curiosity in journalists. Are we being as curious? Are we holding the powerful as account as we should be? I mean, are we letting the notion that a partisan network or a partisan publication is dictating the way we tell the story? I mean, you've been able to see both sides of it. And look, but how do you inform us that way? How do you give us that sense?
Well, by creating alternate projects like these podcasts, and I know I keep going back to that, but it's a really important part of how I've defined my career late in my career. Because CBS News has the morning show and it has evening news, and as the chief Washington correspondent, my voice tends to be more valued in the analytical perspective, and we're not always spending as much time analyzing the news as we are reporting it. And so I've had to find other ways in which to use all the things I've learned and apply them and create for CBS things that make money, things that attract an audience, and things that build awareness of our brand. And my podcasts have done all of those things on a very entrepreneurial basis. I didn't wait to ask anyone's permission. I didn't ask for any staff. I recruited volunteers. All the people who work on all my podcasts are all volunteers. Not a single person other than me is even tangentially assigned to this work. And that's how you have to do. You have to be scrappy. You have to be entrepreneurial right now in order to create not content, because journalism and content are not synonymous. I will get on my soapbox if you want me to, but I'll just say that they are not synonymous. A cat video and journalism are not the same thing. A recipe for a killer lasagna and journalism are not the same thing. Both are content in a sort of content way, but journalism is distinct, and it takes a lot of work and effort and things you got to pay for to create your good journalism, and that's why it's distinctive. But one of the ways that you do this work is to try to meet the audience where it exists. And in the podcast world, I've tried to do that, and I've tried to be as complementary to the day-to-day flow of news. I mean, so for example, when all of Afghanistan was falling apart, who was on my show, The Takeout? General David Petraeus. Now, some people might say, what do you want to talk to him for? He was part of the failure. Well, all right, maybe so. And we talked about that. But we also had this person who had spent more time in Afghanistan and Iraq than any other commanding general in the entire war on terrorism. Well, that's trying to be in the complete flow of news. And that's 45 minutes. That's more than Face the Nation can provide. It's more than any Sunday show can provide. But if you're really interested in that topic in the moment, and I can book David Petraeus, which I can, that adds value. That adds historical value and context. And 3 weeks before that, we had your former colleague from the Washington Post, Craig Whitlock, on to talk about the Afghanistan papers, which David Petraeus dismissed as overblown. Oh, really? Okay, so in 3 weeks, we had two distinctly different perspectives on not only Afghanistan, but what people were saying in private about Afghanistan that they weren't saying publicly. To me, that creates a service. That creates a body of knowledge, kind of a library, an archive of things that people can reach into and take out as they need it. So one of the solutions, I think, for everyone in journalism is finding different ways to reimagine a relationship with a consumer of news and establish new connectedness to an audience in any way that you can. And I've tried to find ways.
Oh, I love that. I'm glad you've talked about podcasts, because I was listening to one of your other podcasts that talked about 2020 and comparing it to 1945. And yeah. I think that, that's a great example of storytelling in many different ways, but really what you've just been talking about here, a little bit about the dilemma every journalist has in trying to cover the day-to-day news, but also the responsibility of us to not only get it right, but also, to me, context is so important, because often I'll get this was, make some sense out of this for us. Well, right. What is journalism not doing? Why is there confirmation bias? Why are people believing certain things and other things? But talk about that in the few minutes we have with you. I mean, I love that because everyone talks about 2020 was the worst year ever, and then we had 2021, and so we don't know what 2022. But you did an interesting thing there to kind of again provide context using historical fact, data points that are well in the public domain, but you kind of make some parallels. Talk about that and kind of your philosophy and strategy in pulling together those kinds of pieces.
Yeah. So for those who might be interested in and have 30 minutes to enjoy one of the podcasts, I'm glad you mentioned, because I'm kind of proud of it, is 2020 Vision. I use that as kind of a setup to look at 1945, because we all thought, for a lot of reasons, very completely justifiable, that 2020 was a mind-bending year. It felt cataclysmic in so many different directions. People have long since forgotten that when 2020 started, the biggest story in the world was Australian wildfires that were consuming 1/3 of this country. You know, what? Oh yeah, I have some vague recollection because so many other things happened in 2020. Well, if you go back and look at 1945, in terms of what was at stake, the precipice the entire world was on, the amount of death that occurred on a day-to-day basis, the kinds of things that were happening in places like Dresden or firebombing of Tokyo long before the hydrogen bomb was dropped. 100,000 people died in Tokyo in 36 hours through aerial bombardment. Dresden was leveled, a straight up Allied authored war crime. Civilians were slaughtered by the tens of thousands because at that stage of the war in 1945, both sides would not accept anything other than total victory, and anything that pushed them closer to total victory was now permissible. Things that would have been ruled out completely, categorically in the earlier years of the war were now on the table and used with aggression. Not only that, we had the creation of the hydrogen bomb, the testing of it, the deployment of it, all the negotiated things, the carving up of the post-World War II world. All of that happens in like 4 months in 1945. And there are like 60 other things of massive consequence in that year that still ripple through the lived history we are experiencing now, all of it in one calendar year. And it was just my way of saying, you know, there have been heavy times before, heavy times where the world felt as if it was unraveling, that there was no bottom. In 1945, this was a year where there was a sense that there was no bottom to the civilized world's murderous depravity. No bottom at all, none. Anything was possible in pursuit of victory. And that's why you saw so much literature and music and things in the post-World War II era, not immediately, but within a couple, 8, 9, 10, this sense of trying to make some sense of it. And this kind of revulsion, much more so than even after the revulsion of World War I, which brought a lot of that. So 1945 lives with us and has lived with us every single year since. And so I just try to do that in a way to say, not that it's happened before, because it never happens before exactly, but other moments when the world thought it could never be this bad has happened before. And I just did that as a way to say, I sure learned a lot. I'd like to share what I've learned with you.
And it's very well done. I think what our conversation today is shown that there's this kind of cumulative knowledge we gain as journalists, right? And that part of our skill of becoming better journalists and better storytellers is how we learn from year to year, story to story.
And find ways to share that. Finding ways to share that are not defined only by column inches or spaces on a digital screen. And I think that's been my biggest passion the last 4 or 5 years, finding other ways in which to take the things I've learned and try to hand them over. Hold them like what I consider them to be, like little prized possessions. This institutional knowledge I have, I consider a prized possession. It's my life's work, but I don't want to keep it. What good is that?
Yeah.
I want to try to find ways to hand it over.
Which again is another kind of example from print to broadcast to podcasting. Lessons you've learned, certainly in the past year. I mean, are you covering the White House differently than from lessons that you've learned from covering Trump? Or did you cover the Trump White House differently than what you learned from Obama? There are lessons that journalists that you can pass along that maybe are helpful in our role in capturing this story that's seemingly at a more rapid pace than ever. But as you just said, it's always been at a rapid pace. But talk about those lessons you've learned and how you're going about of trying to share those with others.
Look, the key thing about the White House is the country watches the White House and takes cues from the White House. My wife has a doctorate in political science. She's the director of the Graduate School of Political Management at George Washington University. She's a brilliant, brilliant woman. And she has a phrase, which I've spoken on CBS before, that the presidency is the background music of our country. And how loud it is and how discordant it is influences the psyche of our country. And I think that's a beautiful way of phrasing our subliminal relationship to the presidency, because the presidency is the one political office in which we're constantly thinking about our relationship to it, high or low. We're asked as a country all the time, how's the president doing? Approval, disapproval. You know, we poll that now much more aggressively than we ever used to. In Reagan's term of office, we used to poll that question about 8 or 9 times a year. Now we do it anywhere from 120 to 150 times a year, depending on the number of polling organizations. So we ask this question a lot, but the relationship is always on our mind at one level or another. And so when you cover the White House, the thing you have to remember is continuing that conversation I talked about earlier, building that conversation is not for you. It's not for the Washington Post. It's not for CBS News. It's not for MSNBC. It's not for Fox. It's for the country, and for the country to decide what it thinks about that. And your questions and that body of ask and answers that you build is not for anyone other than the country itself. It's the biggest journalistic job for the country. And so it doesn't matter if the country likes or dislikes the president more or less at any given time, but that it goes up and down ought not to influence how you do your job. The one constant for you is to hold people in power accountable. And you're going to be pressurized by whoever's in that White House not to do that. And you're going to be liked more if you don't and disliked more if you do. And you've got to live with that and understand that. And there'll be all sorts of threats. This is one of the things I've learned, all sorts of threats to cut off your access and all sorts of threats to ostracize you. It won't happen. It'll only happen if you buy it and fall for it and self-ostracize yourself by not being aggressive enough. Aggression only builds respect. You'll get a lot of anger. You get a lot of stuff in your face. But in the end, people who are being held to account know who's holding them to account, and they know who isn't. And they'll shower those who aren't with all sorts of false flattery. And they'll rage at those who do. But with each and every rageful word, you will be able to hear over time grudging respect. And that's one of the hard parts of this job, showing up every day and being willing to have that rage inflicted on you. But that's how you know you're actually doing this well. And that's a hard lesson to learn. And I didn't learn it initially. I didn't, because you're young and you're in the 5th row. I mean, my journalism career, you can mark it. The first question I ever asked of Joe Lockhart, then Bill Clinton's press secretary, was in the 5th row. And now I ask him from the front row. And if you don't think it was my goal to get from row 5 to row 1, you don't know anything about me. It was definitely my goal to get from row 5 to row 1. But early on, you feel like, well, I'm a little inexperienced, and I don't see the big guys or gals getting as much in your face. So what do I do? What do I do? How do I be nice? How do I be liked? Forget all that. Forget all that. Forget all that. Focus on the task, and the task is holding people accountable, knowing what you know, pressing the questions, getting the answers, and then handing it off to the country.
It's a lot of responsibility. But
yeah, it's not just stenography.
Just not taking down the notes and reading your notes, but typing them into your BlackBerry and reading them on the live screen, right?
I'm glad you mentioned the BlackBerry. God, I miss it.
There you go.
I miss it so much. I miss it so much.
There you go.
Greatest work device ever.
It worked. It worked, didn't it? What have I missed, Major? Any upcoming projects you want to tell us about that you're working on?
Yes, I'm finalizing a contract for a book on the 2020 election, but not the kind of book on the 2020 election you might expect. Most post-election books are, of course, written about the victor and the defeated, the victor and the vanquished, who won and why, who lost and why. That's a really important part of journalism. Theodore White made that a crucial part of any journalists born from the 1960s forward about how to think about the presidency and the combination of the presidency and journalism. And there are lots of great books about that. Some have already been written. My book on the 2020 election is about the guardians of democracy, whose people you don't know and whose names have never been written down. They are, in some certain respects, the secretaries of state in their given states, and you might know a few of their names, the county officials, and the people who worked the polls and who collected the votes and who tabulated them and who made this election in 2020 not only the most secure, the most verified, highest turnout, most pandemic haunted election in our history, meaning the most successful election under the hardest circumstances in the history of our country. And for that good work, these friends and neighbors of ours in swing states were hounded, harassed, threatened with death, and other forms of violence. And I want to tell their story because it's never happened before in our country and it can never happen again. So it's an off the beaten path story about the 2020 election. But the reason false lawsuits filed by those who challenged the results of this election failed is because these people did their job for almost no money, for no fame, for nothing else but to serve their community. And I want to write down their names. That's my next project.
Well, it will probably be right more on time than we can ever have imagined, Major. So, but we'll be looking forward to that. Listen, thanks for your time today.
Neil, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much. Great spending time with you and everyone in the larger community. Thanks so much for listening.
Well, thanks for your time and sharing some stories and insights and lessons learned and being part now of the Mayborn Literary Nonfiction Conference family. So best of luck to you.
I bid you happy farewell from my dining room.